Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us in person and on Zoom this evening. I hope wherever you are, it's nice and cool and you're managing to, to stay out of the heat today. As we gather today, we're all on Indigenous lands. For those of you joining us from home, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous presence in your area, both past and present. Those of us at the Museum of the White Mountains are on Indakina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. And we're grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. And personally, I'm grateful to the Abenaki and Wabanaki elders who took time to think with me about our summer exhibition. I greatly benefited from our conversations. And I know that this evening we'll all benefit from what I know will prove to be a lively conversation about the state of maple. And I'm excited to have Sarah Stanley, who agreed to be our moderator for this event. And Sarah joined the National Forest Foundation in December of 2021. She's an 11th generation Mainer who moved to the White Mountains this winter. As the New England Program Manager for the Northern Forest Foundation, focusing on the White Mountains. Prior to working with the foundation, Sarah served for 3 years as the executive director of the Kennebunk Land Trust. And thank you, Sarah, for agreeing to moderate for us tonight. And I will leave the introductions to you.
Great. Firstly, before we begin, I just want to thank Megan and the museum for having us all bring us together this evening, and thank everyone who's come in person and virtually, as well as our panelists today. So I want to begin with just brief introductions, and then we'll sort of kick things off with a series of questions and then have sort of an organic conversation about our state of maple. So to start, I want to start with, we'll go down our table here. So with Steve. So Steve Roberge, Steve is a New Hampshire licensed forester and sugar maker. He's growing up in Berlin. Steve developed a strong connection to the Great North Woods, the working forest, and the people earning their living outside in the forest. He worked for UNH Cooperative Extension for 14 years as a county extension forester and maple specialist. Today, Steve is UNH's Cooperative Extension Specialist in Forest Resources for the state, overseeing the County Extension Forester Program and still serving as the New Hampshire Maple Specialist. He earned a BS in Forest Science from the University of New Hampshire and a Master's of Forest Science from Yale University. At home, Steve tends to his maple trees that he and his family tap every spring. So welcome, Steve. Next up, we've got Dave Fuller of Fuller Sugar House in Lancaster, New Hampshire. So Dave has said that he's been involved in maple most of his life. He's built his first sugar house when he was 17. And next season will be his 50th season, which and we had a little pre-meeting before this, and I just was shocked at 50 seasons of maple sugaring. It's pretty amazing. So he started with just 200 buckets and now has 26,000 trees tapped using tubing and as well as a state-of-the-art modern sugar house. Over the years, his syrup has been judged best in New Hampshire and also best in North America. Fuller Sugar House is a family-owned and operated small business located in Lancaster, New Hampshire, a quaint scenic town in northern White Mountains. It's surrounded by the presidential range, and its rugged beauty is part of what makes the syrup rich in flavor. I would definitely agree, I would say. Each spring, the Fullers tap more than 26,000 trees to produce over 11,000 gallons of pure New Hampshire syrup. His product line includes 3 grades of maple syrup, maple candy, maple sugar, maple cream, and all from 100% pure maple syrup. So if you haven't had dinner yet, think about dessert. Great soil, pure water, state-of-the-art equipment, and constant attention to detail goes into every maple product that the Fullers make. They love what they do, and they think their product definitely shows it. And then last on our panel here to my left is Ben Farina. He currently serves in the role as the forest silviculturist on the White Mountain National Forest. He brings along 11 years of experience in silviculture and a forestry degree from the University of New Hampshire. He is a lifelong resident of the Plymouth area, and enjoys coaching baseball and basketball at Plymouth High School in his spare time. So welcome all to our panelists, and I think let's kick things off. So I'd like to just sort of start before we jump into our questions and chat a little bit about sort of what brings you here. So we've heard a little bit about your backgrounds, sort of how does that apply to our state of maple discussion tonight? So feel free to jump in.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in my role with Cooperative Extension, I work primarily with private forest landowners, so people who maybe own 30 acres or 3,000 acres. And it's our role in the state within Cooperative Extension to essentially educate and provide materials for those landowners to make good management decisions. And in that mix of landowners that we meet with, somewhere between 60 to 100,000 acres a year worth of landowners, there's some sugar makers hiding out in those woods as well. So we interact with those folks too. We provide them with resources they need, everything from maintaining sugar maple health, managing sugar maple in terms of producing a good sugar bush, but also there's other folks within Cooperative Extension that deal on the business side of things as well. So business expansion, essentially taking that shoebox full of files and sorting out their costs and things like that. So we run the gamut with Extension, working with these private landowners, both on the forestry side, but also on the maple side as well. We are certainly not at the University of New Hampshire what the University of Vermont is. UVM has an amazing maple program, and we try not to replicate what they do because they do such a good job here in New England already. So at the university, we are kind of looking into alternative syrups. I know Dave probably doesn't want to hear any of that, but looking at such a tree physiology, how sap flows in other hardwood trees, and looking if there's a potential to expand the markets right now. So I work with a team out of the Department of Natural Resources that's dealing with that as we speak. So.
Awesome. So if somebody wanted to know how to tap their own tree or any research behind that, they could go to Cooperative Extension and learn a little bit more about how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. We hold a number of sugar maker trainings, everything from backyard sugar making. So if you have 5 taps, you want to do it for kids, how do you do that in a way that maintains tree health, but is also safe for the family to do and all that. And we also look at expanding, and folks who have maybe a couple hundred taps, and they want to move to a couple thousand taps. Like, what does that take? And so we'll do those trainings as well.
Yeah, awesome. Dave.
Well, my idea coming down here tonight is to explain that, a lot of people have the notion that maple syrup is made in Quebec or it's made in Vermont, but there's a pretty lively maple industry within New Hampshire. I know Steve mentioned to me, he said, you're probably like number 2 as far as size in the state. And now I'm probably 5 or 6. It's sometimes kind of quiet what goes on, but it really is a very vibrant industry. Part of what we do, yes, we produce maple syrup. We also sell equipment to other sugar makers, and we install tubing for people if they don't have the time or they don't have the expertise to do it. And those sugar bushes have ranged in size from maybe a few hundred taps to as many as 30,000 taps. So, maple is alive, and quite honestly, I feel very fortunate. Maple is my passion. Before I built my own sugar house, I helped build a sugar house at the local high school I went to. And before that, I was underfoot with the neighbors on either side of the farm. They tolerated me, so I've been doing this virtually my entire life. And I feel I'm the most fortunate person in the world because maple is my passion, and I have a lovely wife that's tolerated it for 48 years and about a week.
Thanks, now, Ben, can you share a little bit about how the Forest Service approaches maples and the state of maple? And we know in our introduction, we shared that you're a silviculturist. For folks that don't know or are unfamiliar about what that means, can you share a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so silviculture is defined as the art and science of controlling forest vegetation, establishment, composition, structure, and growth. But I like to think of it more as going to get into a little bit of terminology. So it's terminology. So the first term is going to be a stand, which is going to be kind of an area of trees that are of like species or of like age or just similar in a way. So think of a stand, or it could be a couple stands, it could be somebody's backyard, or it could be landscape level. And you have this idea of how you want that to look, or the values you want to get out of that, whether you're a hunter, whether you enjoy bird watching or recreation, or you're trying to manage your timber or your woodlot for timber management. So you have this idea in a desired outcome. So, and then you have kind of your current condition. Silviculture is the toolbox that you're going to use to get there. You're going to use silvicultural methods to regenerate these species, or you're going to pick these species to give them growing space to produce more acorns, to enhance wildlife habitat, or put more, make your trees grow faster so they're more valuable. So that's kind of how I would describe silviculture.
Awesome, thank you. And so we've talked a little bit about tree stands and tubing and all those sort of things, and the research and background that goes into that kind of work. Yesterday, sort of in our little pre-meeting huddle, we talked a little bit about red maples versus sugar maples, and there are many different types of maple trees. So I was just wondering if we could chat a little bit about, how do we identify one maple from another? What are the defining characteristics of that? Can both be tapped, all of those sort of things, if we want to dive into that a little bit. And what does the resource look like in New Hampshire? We talked about sizes of sugar houses or those types of things. What does that industry and resource look like in New Hampshire when we're looking at red and sugar maples?
Yeah, I'll start with the ID.
Yeah,
because that's the easy one. But yeah, so there's some easy ways to remember how to identify both maples. One of them is that sugar maple, if you look at the leaf, the leaf has most of the time 5 points on that leaf, so you can spell sugar on the points of the leaf. And then in between the points are these smooth sinuses, these smooth cuts that look like U's, and there's the letter U in the word sugar. So another way of figuring that out as well. And the edges of the leaves are smooth, not jagged or serrated. So you can remember that sugar is smooth. That's a pretty easy way to do it. The other thing is that sugar maple twigs are usually a brownish color, like the color of chocolate, which is also pretty sugary. And then their buds, when you press your thumb on them, are very sharp. And they're not really small, but they're much smaller than red maple buds. So if you see a tree that you think, oh, it's a maple, when you look at the buds and they're kind of pointy, and you grab onto one and they're sharp, almost like you get your skin, that's sugar maple. So sugar smooth, sharp, and some other things, and then red maple, most of the time the leaf is rough or serrated, so red is rough. There's 3 points on the leaf as well. So you can spell red on there, on the leaf. And then pretty much any time of year, there's going to be something red on a red maple. The buds, the twigs, the leaves in the fall, the flowers in the spring. So there's always something that's red on a red maple. And they have these big round red buds. And right while sugaring season is going, you can actually see those red buds going 55 down the highway. You can identify a tree by that, just by the size of those red buds, or across a field or something like that. So very distinct trees, but like I said, I tap both red and sugar maple, and I know a lot of people do too. Dave, I'm sure you want to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate in that. I say we're fortunate. Maybe 3-4% of the trees we tap are actually reds. Reds are actually looked at, and no, we don't tap reds. Kind of that, slum tree, if you will, of sugaring. And well, UVM just did a pretty extensive study, and they determined that sugar content is virtually the same. Quantity of sap is very, very similar. If red gets a bad name from a sugar maker point of view, it might be that it tends to bud in before a sugar maple will, although it's pretty subtle, a few days, maybe a week. Location, we actually went for a while and did not tap reds. And then, the business side kicked in and said, wait a minute, there's a resource. And so, we're in a position. I own 19 trees that we tap. The rest of them we lease. And the landowners, for the most part, say, that's maple tree. We want you to tap it so you can pay us for it. So we do. And one of the things that when we started, probably 50% of the trees we tapped were reds. We tended to make a little bit darker and a little stronger flavored syrup. Beyond that, they're just fine. Now, like I said, it's such a, actually the biggest sugar maker in New Hampshire, who claims a little over 100,000 taps, says that over 50% of his trees are reds.
And Dave, can you speak a little bit to what the industry looks like in New Hampshire versus in other, surrounding states? I would say capacity wise, and then economically, all those sort of things.
Well,
just estimating, on the whole.
I guess the best way to sum it up, we're right beside Vermont. So we say Vermont makes the most, but we make the best because, there's such a difference in scale. This past spring reported crops, Vermont made about 2.5 million gallons of syrup. New Hampshire had reported, I think, around 160, 165.
It's always 160.
Yeah, and now I say reported because I would say a pretty heavy percentage of the small sugar makers, which are the majority in New Hampshire, don't report their crop to the crop service because they have this fear that the crop service is going to give that information to the IRS.
Yeah.
But Vermont is the biggest in the United States. But this past spring, reported production was around 55 million pounds. In the United States, 211 million pounds in Quebec.
Wow. That's quite a bit of syrup. And then also, Ben, how do our maples look on our national forest? What, I don't know, percent or, what's the makeup of our tree species?
It's a good question. I guess I can get into talk about silviculture. We can get into the silvics, which is just the characteristics of given species and kind of how they deal with different environmental factors. So red maple actually is a pretty cool tree. It's super generalist. It can grow on dry soils, wet soils. It's mid-tolerant, tolerant, or shade tolerance is another term, kind of how trees react to light. Tolerant trees are going to be able to deal with a certain degree of shade, whereas intolerant trees are going to need kind of full sunlight. So red maple is a mid-tolerant tree, whereas sugar maple is a tolerant tree. So it doesn't do as well competing once it gets to the overstory, it's fine, but getting there is kind of the challenge. Whereas red maple can compete in the understory under shade. It can compete with the intolerant fast-growing species. Red maple also seeds every year, which is pretty cool. Sugar maple takes 3 to 7 years to seed a good seed crop. Sugar maple requires, there's some site requirements for sugar maple. It requires a certain degree of calcium, calcareous bedrock in rich sites. Whereas, like I said, red maple can kind of grow anywhere, climbs right up the hill, high elevations too. The only thing, sugar maple is a pretty long-lived tree, grows wildly. I read until 400, I think more like 250 years old, whereas red maple is a little bit lesser, 150 years.
Yeah. Awesome. And then Oh, I also wanted to ask as an aside, I thought of this on the way over here. And you might not know the answer to this, but best place on the forest probably to see your pops of color. I know we're gonna come up on the fall here. Summer's sadly closing itself out. Any recommendations on that? And if people want to go out after this time of the talk and look at different types of maple trees, are there certain spots that are good to see a good stand of those types of trees?
So your question before that was kind of what the composition of the national forest is. And Steve actually told me, I didn't know this, red maple is actually the most common tree in New Hampshire. And probably up there with beech on the national forest. So you don't really have to go far to see red maple. Sugar maple is pretty common too. It's part of the northern hardwoods group along with American beech and yellow birch, along with paper birch and aspens. So I don't think there are too many places on the forest where you could go where you wouldn't see that. But as far as views go, I think Kangamaugus Highway is tough to beat, or Crawford Notch.
Yeah, no, those are definitely great spots and plenty of viewpoints too, and different diversity of trails. So if somebody wanted a more challenging hike or just wanted to pop over to a scenic viewpoint, they definitely have some options to look at maple trees that way.
Yeah, see, I'll just butt into with red maple. I think perhaps the best foliage for red maple is probably gonna be happening the next 2 to 3 weeks, where you have red maple around a wetland, and usually late August, they're starting to just this brilliant red that just pops out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And so it's like low in the landscape and around a wetland, you'll find those. So,
Is that the same as a swamp maple?
yeah. If you go to Vermont, they'll call it a white maple as well, but Acer rubrum is the.
Because there's also a silver maple, which is a little different beast.
But can it, I mean, if someone was going to do it on their own land, they've got a tree, would they try to do all of those different maples? Make sugar from, or only the red and sugar?
On a small scale, yeah, you could, anything that's a maple tree. I know people, I've walked woods with waders on because they were silver maple right in a river plain and they were being tapped. So yeah, you can, if it's a maple in the maple family, you can tap it and produce syrup.
There's a fellow in Manchester who lives right in the Merrimack River who taps, he has about 50 taps and they're all silver and Norway maples. And he makes syrup is fine.
Yeah.
So what is the taste difference?
Usually,
The flavor, I mean, typically you might end up with a like a deeper color, darker syrup with a more pronounced flavor. So by today's standards, that seems to be the dominant trend. People want that dark, strong flavored syrup. That's another thing that's kind of evolved. When we started sugaring, if you weren't making, well, at that time it was called fancy, then it became light amber. Now I hope it's the final name of golden. We sell a little bit of golden. I get a kick out of making it, but most people don't want it. They want an amber or a dark syrup. So, any maple.
And Dave, how do you make one versus the other? I guess I know that it takes a lot of, I've tapped a tree in my own backyard before, and it takes a lot of, sap to make the maple syrup. So how do we, if I had a bunch of trees like you, how do I get something really dark or something really light? What goes into that?
Well, you turn a dial.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, we get that question all the time, and you get right down to it. We can manipulate colors and flavors a bit, but at the end of the day, it's all about Mother Nature and what's going on outside in the environment right now on a given day. This past spring, we actually made, as much as I like making golden syrup, we made more than I really wanted to. And that's the way it was.
Yeah.
In 21, I couldn't beg any golden syrup, but 21 was a warmer season and the weather was just completely different. It's really kind of a crazy business to be in because
You don't know what it's
you
gonna.
just don't know.
Awesome.
No control. What about climate change? You know, what they talk about on the street is we aren't gonna be producing nearly as much maple syrup. Because the maples won't regenerate with, as we become like, coming all the time, we're gonna be Richmond, Virginia.
Yeah, well, that's exactly where I think we're heading in this conversation. So my big sort of closing, I've been watching the time and things. My closing sort of question, I think, for tonight, or that might sprout out into some other things is, you know, what are our changing seasons and the climate change, all those sort of things, how are that impacting our maple trees, you know, from an environmental standpoint, from an economic standpoint, you know, I'm sure that things look differently than they do when Dave started 50 years ago, or when the Forest Service, you know, was working 10 years ago, or the Extension Office was researching or working on different educational opportunities. So what's happening now, and how does it look from what was happening before, and what does the future might hold?
Yeah, sure, I can start. Kind of the projections they're talking about are warmer year-round temperatures, even into the winter, a wetter climate, kind of hard to believe this summer, but more believable, more rain, but coming in fewer events. So those events can be more rainfall, kind of a short period of time. So I guess specific to maple, what does that mean? And in the sugaring season, definitely a variable winter with kind of warm-ups in the middle. If there's more temperatures that are kind of hovering around freezing, and we're getting that snow that we're used to getting, that's going to turn into ice, and there's going to be maybe a little more presence of ice storms and ice storm damage, which is just kind of the breaking of limbs, more injuries to trees that they need to heal over. The good news is that's going to be a longer growing season for trees, but that's also a longer growing season for insects that affect the trees too. What else? There's going to be kind of a reduction in snowpack. So one thing I didn't mention is sugar maple tends to have kind of shallower root systems. So historically, with a lot of harvest coming in the winter, this heavy equipment can just drive over those roots, and there's no issues. There's enough snow to insulate those roots and protect them. And if there's going to be reduced snowpack, then that's going to be a little bit detrimental to kind of the residual tree with soil disturbance and root compaction. How does kind of the variability affect the sugaring season in your mind?
My woods crew might disagree with you because we tap trees in the shadow of Mount Washington. Just plenty of snowpack. We're in that, but no, you know, the weather certainly has been changing. But for us, some of the differences are that when we started sugaring, we were using buckets. And the qualifier for when we started sugaring with when does it warm up enough to settle the snow enough so we can get the tractor in the woods to put the buckets out. And there were, you know, just the unwritten rules. You don't tap before March, you know, the old standby rules. Well, now we literally start tapping the day after Christmas or the first working day after Christmas, just because of the sheer number of trees we're tapping. So therefore, when we get those warmer January thaw, for example, now we haven't made syrup in January, but we've made a lot of syrup in different years in February. We've got a certain amount of trees tapped. All of that tubing is running down to the sugar house. The sap going into the tanks. I'm going to make syrup. So, you know, once again, the weather is changing, but we've learned to adapt. Another part of this whole equation was when we started sugaring 50 years ago, you had to wait to March because the spouts we were using because of, let's face it, there's bacteria in everything we do. And so you take and drill that hole and put that spout in a tree. The tree has a mechanism to understand, well, I've got an injury, I've got bacteria. They seal that off. That tap hole is viable for 6 weeks. Now we put a brand new spout in the tree every year. Now we can trick that tree into staying viable up to 4 months. Just out of, like I said, pure necessity because of the scale that we're sugaring and a lot of other people are sugaring. So yes, the climate, the weather is changing, but in our operation and a lot of other operations in New Hampshire or New England, at the scale we're sugaring, you're talking well into the 7 figures to do that. In the short term, I think maple is viable.
Yeah.
Certainly for the rest of my life and my kids and probably my grandkids. I can't speak to beyond that, but
Yeah, I think you did a really good job of summarizing how technology has kept pace or has exceeded the pace of what may be happening in the woods in terms of other pressures, either from changing climate, from the trees getting older. But certainly the technology has changed so much in the industry. You're able to get more syrup out of a tap than you were 40 years ago. So that's, all things consistent. And the other thing too is that, Ben described, essentially the climate, and Dave talked about weather, and those are 2 different things. Someone described that to me as that weather is what's on your daily news, your nightly news. That's what's happening right now. And sugaring relies so much on weather. And I think we'll always have the weather for sugaring here. Climate really impacts what a stand or a landscape of trees will be on site. And that's kind of the unknown that we have is as things warm up, as systems change, having these small droughts with big rainstorms, less snowpack, how does that affect sugar maple? And we just don't have an answer for that at this point. The thing that gives me hope though is that you can go down to North Carolina and find people who produce maple syrup. Go down to Georgia actually, and there's sugar maple down there too. So if you look at the range of sugar maple, it goes from Georgia all the way up to Canada, and those trees are growing on sites that are what we call sugar maple sites. And so that's one thing as a forester, and I know Ben gets with this all the time too, is what's the soils telling you. And so if you're on a good sugar maple site, it means the soils are suited for sugar maple. Those trees are going to be way more resilient to disturbances such as drought, insects, ice storms, you name it. And so having that knowledge of the landscape and able to manage for that, I think is pretty important. And that's where kind of how we opened up with Ben was like, how does silviculture help us get to that point?
Right. Can I just add something? So climate change, the projections I'm talking about, and probably what you've heard, it's a very gradual process. A lot of them are anywhere from like 2 degrees to 6 or 8 degrees average over a whole year. So that's not going to happen overnight. And our trees are pretty adaptive and resilient, just like Steve described. So I've seen studies where trees have been able to take on that quick change in temperature, and it takes a couple of years, but they adapt to it. Or if it's too warm during the winter, they can go dormant too warm during the summer, they can go dormant for a short period and then pick up growth after that. So especially with young trees, I don't think there's going to be an issue with regeneration if we just keep to our practices.
Seems to me it was harder for the sugars to adapt to the trees. Right? Because you're not supposed to start, at least down my way, we weren't supposed to start before February 20. And then 15 years ago, we started 3 times from now, we were getting a really good run in January, and you just get your ass out and get going.
Yeah, I live in Peterborough, and usually if I don't have my taps in the first week of February, I may have lost some good runs at that point. But and so that's just
So my question is, if you're tapping the trees for longer, what does that do to the health of the tree?
Great question.
actually, it doesn't we're tapping that tree during the dormant season, if you will. So we're not affecting its growth or anything like that. What we're actually doing is capturing some of that sap that's going up to the crown to nourish that new crop of leaves. And of course, people say, well, you should be saving that sap for the tree. But my understanding is a typical maple tree at any given time might have as much as 300 gallons of sap in it in the spring. And typically we're taking 20 to 25 gallons of sap out of each tree each spring. One of the interesting things about what we're doing now, and it's different methods, learning more. When we started sugaring, if you made in the maple world, you talk about quantity of syrup in pounds. So if we made 2 pounds of syrup in a given spring, oh, that's a pretty good crop. Well, that's less than a quart of syrup. Well, now that standard is between 5 and 6 pounds. We're taking more sap, but we're still really not hurting the resource. It's, the goose and the golden egg thing, you don't overtap and you do things correctly. And actually putting a new spout in every year actually helps the tree health because you're introducing less bacteria into that tree.
I have to just tell you the story where at Cape Cod, and now they don't serve maple sugar anymore. They can get the syrup, whatever that stuff is. So we asked for, we always ask for maple syrup, and they'll give it to you for a certain amount of money. We went into this place and we said, no, we want real maple syrup. And it came in little bottles made in California. And we talked to the management said, you're in New England. What are you doing importing maple sugar from California?
Packaged in California, but imported from Quebec.
That's what we were thinking.
Because I know the little bottle you're talking about.
California, see, they will look at the labels.
There's a researcher in Washington State, or maybe British Columbia, because there's the big leaf maple out there that they tap, and he's looking into maple syrup industry on that side of the, or on the Pacific side.
It's all about the climate,
Yeah.
correct weather. That's the thing with sugaring, you need that freezing night and warmer day, although now, with the way weather is, that is not as predictable as it once was. So, we have this tubing in the woods and in the sugar house or the vacuum station. There's a vacuum pump, you put vacuum on, and in simple terms, people say, well, you're sucking sap out of the tree. Well, it's not that simple, but what we're doing is, in order for that sap to run, the pressure outside, the external pressure has to be lower than the internal pressure. So on those so-so days on the weather, the atmospheric pressure may be greater, so the sap doesn't run. By introducing vacuum, we reduce that pressure, lets that tree run on days that it wouldn't normally run.
And it doesn't hurt the tree.
No, I mean, UVM and Proctor Research Center, they do, they are the source. Cornell has a very good program too, but Proctor is really probably the best. And their attitude is, if you're not using vacuum, you can't be viable and you're not hurting the tree.
Yeah, they've done, the neat thing about Proctor is they have an amazing living laboratory where they can do these multiple tests within a stand of trees, where you may have one tree that is on gravity tubing or a bucket. The next tree is, what is it? It could be a bucket, it could be, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, gravity tubing, vacuum, and then no tapping at all. So that the no tapping is the control there. And so you can see how just a normal sugar maple grows without tapping being done. And you can compare, you know, the other impacts of sugaring, and they've yet to find any you know, noticeable changes in tree growth and tree health with that too. So that's kind of the standard that we look at, is how are the trees growing? It's just not showing up in the measurements.
Do you replace trees in some of your stands, smaller trees? If you do have damage because of wind and do you replace them?
We try to leave our stands stocked to the point where there's a replacement tree coming along. You know, typically, you know, the book says 40 years to get a tree big enough. Well, where we're sugaring, I would say it's probably 50 plus years, depending on the site. I mean, if you're starting in a young site that you're thinning from sapling up, maybe you can shorten that length of time, but virtually all of the trees that we tap are really just wild woods grown trees that haven't necessarily been managed. Our biggest lease is on the Randolph Town Forest. It is former industrial land, and where our lease is, the stand was manipulated, mid-70s, I think, towards creating maple saw logs. So it's very, very dense to maple. The other thing that we like to see, though, you know, we like diversity of species. You know, a sugar maker, if you're very short-sighted, you want only maple trees. Well, diversity of species really can help the woods out if there are bug infestations and so forth.
Yeah, and Ben, how does the Forest Service I mean, there's lots of different species on the forest. How does that management look to make sure that trees and the forest stays healthy? You know, I imagine you look at different species differently.
Yeah, so we don't really manage specifically for maple tapping, although we do have a handful, I think 8 special use permit holders, but that's kind of more of a hobby level tapping. But yeah, we really kind of focus on diversity. So, you know, it doesn't matter if it's high value sugar maple or something lower value. We look at it really holistically and trying to promote species that are the most suitable for the site, or that just are underrepresented for one reason or another. Look at kind of back to climate change and some of the projections and some of the species that are better equipped to take on some of those drier conditions in the future, and try to promote species that are going to have an easier time regenerating and establishing themselves now as opposed to the future. So yeah, I would just say it's a real holistic approach.
Awesome. So it's true. I see a common thread of it's helpful to have different species together,
Absolutely.
you know, and that diversity helps with the health of those trees and being.
All except beech. Nobody likes beech in the sugar bush.
Squirrels do.
Oh, okay, so we had a question in the Zoom chat, now that we're talking about squirrels, and Dave Kavasi wants to know if squirrels are a problem with tubing.
Used to be public enemy #1. Right now, I'm pretty sure that the coyote population is eaten most of the squirrels, and so now the coyotes have moved on to tubing, and probably black bear is probably the #1 problem in the woods right now for us. Bear comes out of hibernation. We have one particular woods where they hibernate on this side of the woods. The other side of the woods, there's a campground that historically, maybe there's some garbage laying around, And they go through in a straight line and, oh, what's this? Chomp, 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 go to the next one. And, yeah, squirrels used to be the biggest problem. Part of that was that when tubing first came out, okay, how do you clean it? Well, research said that a chlorine solution in water, very, very mild solution, will help clean. And then you rinse. Well, chlorine leaves a salt residue. Squirrels love that. All animals love that. So they would chew up tubing. But like I said, right now, you know, I believe in nature and live and let live, but we've got too many bears and coyotes.
All right, conversations for another time regarding bears. Any other questions from the chat we want to cover right now?
Oh, no, yeah, squirrels. When I walk my lines, my hand is always on the line because I'm always looking for these little, it'll just be the smallest little nick from a squirrel's tooth. And that little hole will just allow for air to get in and you lose all your vacuum right there too. So I'll just be walking around. If I feel something, I'll take out black electrical tape. That's my cheap way of fixing it. I'm glad Dave agrees with me too.
Sure.
But squirrels are everywhere. Those lines are just riddled with it. The other thing that really annoys me too is either the nuthatches or the titmice will shove seeds into my taps. Anything that's a hole, they're storing the little things.
I haven't
So,
seen that
yeah,
one.
Don't
need
dig
to.
Yeah, exactly. So every once in a while, there's sunflower seeds stuck in there.
You kind of been skirting around, but you keep making references to the need, the bacteria and the need to keep all of this clean, super clean and everything. And I assume there's a whole set of standards for that. But what happens if there's a maker who's not paying attention and they go ahead and make this? What's the human effect?
Actually, I mean, you know, I'm always hesitant to use the B word because people go, oh my God, there's bacteria in my maple syrup. Well, it's a naturally, you know, there's bacteria and yeasts and molds and everything we do. As bacteria numbers grow, the sap that comes out of the maple tree is the sugar in that sap is sucrose. As if you have a poorly maintained system, or as you get warmer air temperatures, those bacteria counts increase. They go after that sucrose. They break it down into glucose and fructose, and in the maple world called invert sugars. And those sugars tend to darken and caramelize more in the evaporation process. You know, we control that and that gets back to the leaks.
Yep.
If you pull air into a line because a squirrel chewed it or a bear chewed it, well, you're pulling in bacteria, and that can degrade the quality of sap. Therefore, you're going to make a little darker syrup. It doesn't spoil anything.
So there are no human really effects.
Oh, no.
It's all in the quality of the taste, the color, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, this day and age, like I said, people seem to be going more toward the darker grades, and there are some sugar makers that very specifically do things to make darker grades of syrup because that's what their customers want.
Awesome. Well, I think looking at our time here, I kind of want to end on sort of jumping off point of some of the audience questions of sort of what resources are there for the public and people that may be interested after listening today to go out in their backyard and tap that maple tree that might be out there. You know, from a silviculture perspective, then how do they know if, you know, they've got the right soils and, you know, the right trees back there? How would they find a tap if we're looking, you know, from that perspective? And how would they do a setup? Because that's certainly a lot different than you know, the kind of setups that you guys are producing. So where does that all come together? If somebody just wanted to learn more about tree species in general, are there good resources out there for people to know? So if we just wanted to cover that sort of where to go next. So Ben, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
I would suggest calling a extension forester.
There you go.
Maybe Steve can.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, there's a lot that goes into sugaring that people don't think about, and you know, Ben can talk about kind of tree health and assessing
Yeah.
tree health, but you know, for private landowners, UNH Extension has a county forester in every county here in New Hampshire, which is unique in the nation, actually. Most states don't have that. And we're available to work with private landowners and answer questions about woodlots, provide resources, all those things. On our website, nhwoods.org, that'll keep you to the UNH website. There is a maple syrup section with a number of fact sheets and how to get started, type of things to consider. We hold a number of trainings. I've been doing them online actually, because it's a lot more convenient than me driving to 10 counties in February. And the other thing is the New Hampshire Maple Producers Association, which is the trade organization here in the state. That's, you know, there's probably a couple hundred members of that, and those are all sugar makers who usually are very receptive to helping people out, opening the doors. They're good,
Exactly.
essentially your neighbors. So I would talk to your sugar maker that's down the street and see if you're interested in getting into it.
Perfect. And then
That's probably your best resource. Go visit a sugar maker, and it doesn't matter whether he's got 5 taps or 50,000 taps. We're a pretty friendly bunch.
yeah, I gathered that from today and our pre-meeting as well. So I guess, well, I'd like to just end on, if one thing you'd like to share, you know, one final thought, I guess, whether it has to do with maple trees or something you want somebody to know about the organization that you work for, your business, or any of those sort of final thoughts, moments, if we just want to end on that, I guess.
Sure. One thing that I heard from talking to a sugar maker this past season was, it was interesting to me, and probably already know this, but it's managing a sugar bush is a little different than managing a stand of timber. Whereas, like I talked about with that heavy machinery, you're managing density and you're trying to put girth on trees. But with sugar making, you're really managing conductive tissue. So really trying to limit the injury to the tree. I talked earlier about trees' ability to seal over wounds. Sugar maple is pretty good in general. Red maple is not as good, and it takes a little bit more energy. It's a little bit softer wood, and with that sweet sap, it's pretty attractive to insects at times. So if you're out there and looking into starting to sugar, just try to not bump into the trees around, because that's going to have an impact on your operation.
Awesome. Any other final thoughts?
You know, if you want to come see a sugar house, come north. The road actually goes both ways. And most sugar houses will invite people in. New Hampshire, as well as every other New England state, has maple weekends, more of a formal organized open house. But anytime you go by a sugar house and you see steam, stop in and say hi.
I'll just say, you know, Dave mentioned he grew up on a farm. I grew up in the big city of Berlin, so it's totally different. But speaking with farmers, you know, I treat sugar maples, the tree themselves, as a piece of farm equipment. The better you treat that tree, the longer it's going to last. If you abuse your tractor, your equipment, it's just going to fall apart over time. The same thing goes with sugar maples. You know, Ben talking about managing them the proper way, not damaging them. The same thing goes with doing additional stress. So if you know that your tree is stressed for one reason or the other, you want to, just kind of think about what you're doing to that tree and how can you improve the health of it, either thinning it out or kind of backing off on maybe do 1 tap instead of 2 taps. So I just remember that these trees are living, they're experiencing stress out there on a yearly basis. So just kind of be in tune with that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. All right, so on that note, before I turn it over to Megan and the museum, I just want to thank again our viewers virtually and in person, and a special thank you to Steve from UNH Cooperative Extension, Dave from Fuller Sugar House, and Ben from the White Mountain National Forest for joining us today and being able to share a whole host of knowledge about maples and the state of our maples. So I imagine that everyone will be thinking about that this winter as they visit those sugar houses, or maybe as they explore our national forests or get out on our public lands. So or even in their backyard. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan and the museum for any final thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you all. And I think we do have a little bit more time if we want to ask them, if there are other questions from our in-person audience, or if folks on Zoom want to put other questions into the chat, I'll read those out, and we can have a little bit more conversation. I doubt there's any lack of further information from our panelists, so I'm sure they have more to share if we have some other questions here in person or on Zoom.
I have a question. Is the tapping of red maples, is that viable now because of tubing? Is that with a vacuum pump? Is that what has made that different? Because of course, years ago, the standard was don't the red maples tap the sugar, especially if you're limited in terms of your buckets. What was I given this information? So for instance, we were told that sugar maples could give you, if you're fortunate, you could even get 4% sugar. But with a red maple, you're not going to get anything close to maybe the 2.5% you'll get out of sugar.
I think we finally got rid of some prejudice against the red maple.
The sap on average is just as sweet in a red maple.
Very close.
Yeah, it can, I find it trends a little lower, but if you imagine, so the research that UVM does live scaled for, production and use. So if I'm someone who has 4 taps and I could double it by adding another 8 red maples, I may hesitate a little bit because there may be lower sugar content in that. But you can measure that though too. You can see what that sugar content is in the sap and see whether or not it's worth boiling all that water away. But if you're a larger producer, say you have 10,000 taps, you're gonna have a whole system of tubing out there. That tubing is already going past the red maple. So the cost is very low to add that red maple on there. You're most likely putting it through a reverse osmosis machine where you're removing much of the water before you even boil it. So a lot of the work is being done already to add that red maple in there. And you're actually getting more sugar out of the sugar bush at that point because of the addition of that red maple. The red maples that I tap, I've tested before just out of curiosity to see where they're at. They're around 2%, which is lower. My sugar bush usually runs around 2.5 traditionally.
That's bragging.
It's a very good sugar bush. It's right in the backyard as well. But it's not my land. But it does trend lower though. And like Dave said, they do wake up or they do start budding out a little bit as well. But sugaring is a very traditional pastime, a very, very traditional process. And I think the prejudice against red maple is just part of that tradition. And I think the research and the science caught up with that.
And of course, the RO makes a huge difference.
What's that?
Reverse osmosis.
The RO makes a huge difference.
Our biggest day this last spring, we made 1,000 gallons of syrup in 7 hours and processed 43,000 gallons of syrup. Sap, I'm sorry. The RO, we were taking out 87% of the water with the reverse osmosis before we hit the evaporator. Now, a lot of people say, well, your syrup's no good because you use reverse osmosis and you're boiling with oil. Well, I don't know. We got plenty of blue ribbons in our sugar house, and it's just a necessary tool. Quite honestly, the quality of our syrup went up when we started using reverse osmosis because we can process sap quicker. You know, I talked about bacteria earlier. Well, what's going to happen with a tank full of sap, a tank full of sugar solution? It doesn't get better with age. So, you know, bacteria comes running and, you know, hey, let's hit this tank of sap. So reverse osmosis is a very, I would dare say, mid-90s or higher of the maple syrup made in North America goes through reverse osmosis.
And you get a lot more sleep.
And you burn,
It helps.
it helps,
It helps.
and you burn less fuel though, too, whether it's cordwood or oil, you're burning less.
Well, we're burning fuel oil.
Yeah.
If I didn't have efficiencies, we'd be burning around 5 gallons of oil to make a gallon of syrup. We all know what happened to oil prices last spring. We are currently between reverse osmosis and some efficiencies in the evaporator. We're using a pint of oil to make a gallon of syrup.
Awesome.
So to me, we're being responsible to, you know, our fossil fuel use. Several years ago, we had this lady in the sugar house buying syrup, and I can't honestly recall, but she worked for an environmental group. And she was scolding me about using fossil fuels. And I said, well, but I'm using reverse osmosis. I'm using what's called a steam away on the evaporator that makes us more efficient. And we're cutting down our use of fossil fuels. And I said, besides, if I burn wood, I'm putting all kinds of particulates in the air, which is a contributor to climate change. And she goes, well, that's not our concern. Some other group worries about that. So, you know, it's a tool.
Right, well, thanks, everyone, and I wanna, not gonna come from the camera, I'm just gonna stay over here and be a disembodied voice. I want to thank you all for coming, and those of you online for joining us. We had one more thing in the chat. Wayne was saying that he was thanking you for this interesting chat, and that they're having grilled peaches with syrup for dessert. So
Okay.
I think it's a bit of a drive, so I don't think they'll wait for us to get there. So they took Sarah up on having syrup with dessert, and we're all really grateful for you coming down tonight. And our programming at the Museum of the White Mountains this summer has been supported by a grant from the New Hampshire State Council on the Arts. So we're really happy, and they consider maple sugaring to be a traditional art. So that's part of what they're interested in supporting as well. And all of our programming is also really supported by our members. So if you aren't already a member, if you consider joining us in supporting the museum, we really appreciate it. So thank you all for coming.